Benedict, first Tory MP to defect, to reform, despite in January calling Richard Tice a pound shop Nigel Farage, despite voting for anybody who crosses the chamber should hold a by-election. He's not holding one. Got very stroppy yesterday at the press conference. Thoughts on the whole process, please, pal?
I'm not sure if it's bananas, but it's a bit nuts. That's what I think.
Hey!
Yeah.
I won't quit my day job. I mean, this is all about Lee Anderson, ultimately. This is Lee I don't think for a second that he's sort of fully invested in the idea of the Reform Party as the great insurgent force that's going to sort of unseat the Tory Party. What Lee Anderson cares about is retaining his seat. And I think, actually, that this does give him the best chance of doing so. I think, broadly speaking, the Conservatives are very unpopular in a lot of red ball seats. I don't think that the Labour Party is as popular as perhaps it would like to be in these former heartlands. And I think being able to stand, rather than stand as an independent and the many difficulties that come with that, having the backing of a party machine behind you, being able to set yourself up saying, well, I'm not Labour, we're not going back to that, but I'm also insurgent against the Tories. They didn't like what I had to say. They got rid of me because they're the Westminster, elite, this, that and the other, but I'm here to fight for you. I can see how probably he was facing losing his seat at the next general election. This, I suspect, gives him a fighting chance of sneaking back in by driving a wedge between the two parties. Because, let's be clear, there's not a lot of love for either of them right now. So I can see why, for Lee Anderson, this would make a lot of sense. From what I understand, actually, it wasn't sort of a cut-and-dried thing that he was going to join Reform, because Reform, a lot of people within Reform were not entirely sure, because of his comments about Richard Tice in the past, whether or not this was actually a good idea to bring in somebody who's been kicked out of the Tory Party. Does that give the wrong impression? But here we are.
Suspended by the Labour Party. So
Exactly.
the assumption is he only leaves if he doesn't get on. But we also talk, sorry, Nick, about Rishi Sunak's judgment. I mean, this is a man. He made him deputy party chairman. I mean, yet again, an appalling example of Sunak. What, out of his depth?
He knew what Lee Anderson
absolutely.
was.
Yeah.
He's fired him for those, not for the comments that he made, crucially, but for not having apologised for them. Should Rishi have come down stronger on Lee Anderson?
I mean, I think he's come down as strongly as he can, I think, and he's sort of taking the Starmer playbook of giving somebody an opportunity to apologise and say it was misconstrued, I misspoke, or I made a mistake, which I think is fair enough, and then he's got rid of him. You couldn't therefore say that he is necessarily the greatest loss. If the Tory party is prepared to kick him out or suspend him, you can't say that they were desperate to keep a hold of him. But as to a question of judgment, this isn't Rishi Sunak's party, really. This is Boris Johnson's party, and he's sort of struggling to keep this coalition of MPs together, and he's finding it very difficult. And we know, actually, that Rishi Sunak does not have the same appeal to some of these seats, these red ball seats, that Boris Johnson had. Whether or not he still has it is another question, but he certainly had that and was able to bring them together. But they're a very different bunch, actually, to sort of, your Tory shires to the manor-born kind of MPs, who represent very different kind of constituencies and who might have found the comments that Lee Anderson made rather beyond the pale, not because they necessarily disagree and think that Sadiq Khan is doing a wonderful job, but they think that the manner in which he went around it was not acceptable.
And, of course, in that clip there, we just saw Lee Anderson say that I've joined Reform because I want to have a voice and I want to speak for the millions of other people who agree with me. Now, of course, he did have a voice in the Tory party. He was a deputy chairman, except for the fact that he got thrown out of the party for refusing to apologise for a very specific comment, which was a conspiracy theory steeped in Islamophobia about Sadiq Khan. So what is he saying about the Reform Party, then? Is that here, within the Reform Party, I have a voice and I can use it to be Islamophobic, just like, as he would say, millions of other people.
He's not saying he can be Islamophobic. He should have apologised for those
But what
comments.
he did was Islamophobic, and he's refused to apologise for it.
But I'm really interested as well. We talked about this earlier. When he says, I want my country back, people will jump on that and go, what? Is he being Islamophobic again, or is he talking about the fact that most of the things that we took for granted for years...
But you've got to listen to my point, Jeremy, which is he said he has a voice within Reform. He did have a voice already in the Tory party. The only thing he cannot speak about in the Tory party is Islamophobia. So is he saying, I can do that and I can make comments like that and I can say things like, I want my country back, and mean things of an Islamophobic nature?
I think Lee Anderson recognises that he did misspeak, but he felt that he couldn't back down. I think what actually, and I think that there is a lot more sympathy if you were to put it this way, which is that there is a broad perception that the Metropolitan Police has not handled these pro-Palestine marches particularly well, and that ultimately does fall at the feet of the Mayor of London. I don't think it's in any way fair to make, what the link that he was making. I think it was very crass. But I think what Lee Anderson would probably say in private is there are legitimate criticisms of how Sadiq Khan has actually handled all of this. He can't actually apologise on that, though, because then people will assume that he's being weak, and he won't be able to portray this idea of a straight-talking man who just shoots from the hip and speaks how he feels, because that's his kind of appeal, ultimately. As to whether or not that reflects very well on reform, I suspect that the Reform Party would probably take the line that I've taken, which is to say that there are major criticisms to be made of the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London, but that they would certainly stop short at that, and that actually he said these things whilst he was a member of the Conservative Party, and we've moved on. But at the same time, they're going to be targeting seats where that sort of straight shooting, even if you misspeak, is not considered the worst crime in the world.
But it is a marriage. It's an unlikely alliance. Richard Tice coming out quite rightly against Islamophobia, and him saying Richard Tice is a pound shop Nigel Farage. Can we?
But he still took him into the party and has asked him to
I would
apologise.
say I think it's going to make for a very interesting internal politics, actually, the clash of the two personalities between Lee Anderson and Richard Tice, because Anderson is not he's not shy and retiring,
and I'm not being rude.
And he's ambitious.
Is Anderson going to take rules from Richard Tice? And bear in mind that the elephant in the room is Nigel Farage. You would blow them both out the water if he chooses to get back involved actively, right?
Which is what I suspect will happen, and is probably why Richard Tice is prepared to allow Lee Anderson, because he doesn't anticipate being the figurehead going into the next general election.
Let's do a segue.
Sure.
Boris Johnson, we were just touching on it. You said it wasn't, it's not Sunak's party, it's Boris Johnson's. Now, stay with me on this, please. Apparently, although people are denying this, relations between him and Sunak have thawed. Their respective camps are saying, and Boris is to be sent out to campaign in the Red Wall seats, the very area that got him an 80-seat majority 3 years ago before the Tory Party threw him out. That's extraordinary if it's true, isn't it?
It's very amusing. I suppose the question, we have to remember part of the reason that Rishi Sunak is in the problems that he is because Boris Johnson managed to lose quite a large lead. And I suppose the question that is now, has the unpopularity of Rishi Sunak plumbed depths to which Boris Johnson is not capable, and therefore bringing him back will actually drag him back up?
He is less popular than Liz Truss, Benedict, with respect.
He's had a lot more time than Liz Truss to get that unpopular. Give her the amount of time.
His judgment isn't great.
But you talk about this 80-seat majority, and I understand that. However, as Benedict just pointed out, he also lost an 80-seat majority. I don't know if that is unprecedented for other Tory leaders, but it was certainly an incredible feat.
He'd lost a lot of support on the back of Partygate. We're not going to get into whether or not that's there, but he had certainly set fire to a lot of his hard-earned support. But are people now looking at Sunak and, as you point out, Liz Truss, and perhaps getting slightly buyer's remorse and saying, actually, we wish that we still had Johnson?
I think people are fed up, right? I think they will accept flawed characters. I think they are fed up with hearing Rishi Sunak say, I'm a victim of circumstance because of the pandemic, because of Partygate or whatever. He is less popular than the worst Prime Minister in Liz Truss that we've ever had. I'm not sticking up for Boris Johnson, but it says nothing about Sunak that he's gone cap in hand again.
But this story says that Johnson is going to be wheeled out, specifically in those red wall seats, that area that, as I just said about Lee Anderson, actually, the Tories are not popular, but Labour are not exactly battering down people's doors. So perhaps they look at that potential and they say, well, again, there is the possibility to still perhaps nick one or two of these, or perhaps, sort of get it into a territory where Labour aren't winning at all, maybe even taking votes away from Labour if we see, for example, another similarity to the George Galloway situation, the Workers' Party of Britain coming in and taking more votes. I think a lot of those seats are actually more in play than we've been led to assume up to now. And I think actually the Labour Party understand that because they are very cautious about putting forward any kind of policy that could prove divisive amongst their own base. Even at this stage, where they're assumed to just be on the coronation trail, they're actually not putting out a great deal of policy. And that tells me they're not actually as confident as perhaps the rest of us are that they're going to be in power.
Very interesting.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you so much to Benedict Spence for that expert.